Hello, friends. This is your friend Kent C. Dodds, and I'm joined by my friend Jenn Creighton. Say hi, Jenn.
Hi.
So, Jenn is a wonderful person. We were just reminiscing over how we got acquainted, and it was last year for React Rally 2018. I was preparing to speak about React patterns, and I wanted to talk about the props explosion that happens when you have this quote unquote reusable component. And I think I asked like, what's one component that you know that has like the most amount of props you've ever seen? And I found one that was like over 100 props. It was nuts. But Jenn responded with the best tweet ever that I actually included in my talk. That was, you said, I call that an apropcolypse. Oh, it was so good. I
Yeah.
loved that. That was so great. So that was my first introduction to the wonderfulness that is Jenn. Jenn, you do a lot more than just tweet really great puns on Twitter. Could you give us a little intro to yourself, please?
I mean, that really was my best pun. So I don't tweet that many puns. I try. But yeah, I am a front end architect at a company called The Wing. We build women first co working spaces. And I joined
Mm,
about 4 months ago. So I'm taking on a new role in front end architecture. And before that, I was working as a senior front end engineer at ClassPass. And I do
interesting.
a lot of talks, a lot of
Hmm.
traveling. Yeah, it's my hobby.
So it's a hobby, not specifically for work.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
Hmm.
work appreciates that I do it. It's definitely a plus for them. But it's not part of my job. I just really enjoy public speaking and teaching.
Wonderful. And I'm looking forward to React Conf where I'll get to experience that firsthand, seeing you give a talk there. I'm not going to spoil it for people, but I am super excited about the talk that you're going to be giving. I believe we should hopefully have this published before that time so people can get ready for that great talk. Not too um, I hope I'm not like overselling it and making you feel uncomfortable, but I heard the topic and it sounds great. Um, so great, Jenn. So you have how long have you been using React?
I would say about 4 or 5 years now. I think five.
Yeah, wow, that's a long time. Like that's definitely more than like way more than half the people. The Okay, if we take all of React's community, all the people using React, you've been using it for longer than way more than half the community, I'm sure. So you've been around for since major version days, like 0.14, probably 0.13, right?
Yeah, 013. That's
Yeah.
around when we started to use it at a company I was actually the person begging us to please use it because we were using Angular 1. Um,
Ah,
and that was my big impetus.
yeah. I can relate to the desire to switch from Angular 1. um, as great as it was, like don't get me wrong, I liked Angular 1 better than Backbone for goodness sake, but yeah, I was pretty happy to move on to React myself. So 5 years of React, I'm sure you've experienced a lot of things. One thing that I have come to realize the longer that I've been working in software is that the longer you work in it, you develop more experience, which like seems obvious, but that's you are exposed to more problems, and therefore you gain more experience. And so, like your experiences of 5 years working with React have probably taught you a lot. What are some of the lessons that you've learned in the process of building React applications, architecting applications, and like some of the mistakes that you've made? What would you say are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned in using React for that time?
In the early days when I was just starting out with React, truthfully, I had no clue what I was doing. Um, Angular 1 was very different, and before that I had worked with a proprietary framework at another startup that, wasn't from a big name. Coming to React was really like a lovely feeling actually because it really aligned with how I was thinking about components in this declarative sort of state. And the talk I'm going to give at React Conf actually really dives into this, like where that comes from in my background with creative writing and why that melds so well with React. And I think some of my earliest mistakes were not leaning into that. Um, not thinking about the structure of the components as declaratively and really still focusing on, well, what do I need to do in this individual component? And then not being able to see like the forest for the trees. Like you're just in the trees and you have no clue and you're adding in props. You're like, I need this one too, and this one. And once
Hmm.
you get out of the component and start to use it, you're like, oh, this is not good. This
Hmm.
does
Yeah.
not feel good. Um, that was like some of the early mistakes, as well as really over focusing on reuse. That was another
Hmm.
like huge pitfall early on. Just thinking like I need to make every single part of this super reusable just in case. Who knows? And I mean, you and I have seen what that leads to. It's the Apropcolypse. Never gonna let that pun die.
Yeah.
But that's how it like starts basically. Someone's like, this has to be as reusable as possible. Just add more props to it, and we can reuse it. Isn't that great?
Hmm.
No, that ends up being, usually a complicated like nest of code that you have to unravel at some point.
Yeah, precisely. Like, I think we get so excited, especially moving from a situation where our code wasn't very reusable to a situation where our code can be super reusable. We get really excited about the possibilities, and as programmers. I think we just naturally have this idea that like, oh man, like I can do all kinds of this magic stuff, and we've got this abstraction that like it's a black box, and I can do all kinds of nutso stuff in here, and but you wind up. It's funny, like in our efforts to make things really reusable and simple, we actually make things harder. From not only the maintenance standpoint, where we're like, no, I'm fine maintaining something hard as long as it makes it easy for everybody else, but it not only makes it harder for ourselves, but it also makes it harder for everybody else. So, how do you avoid that kind of a problem? Like, what do you do to make sure that to solve both problems? Like, I mean, I'm okay with a little bit of complexity that I have to maintain as long as it's easy for everybody else. But like, is there a way that I can make it easy for everybody else and easy for me as a maintainer?
Yeah, and so this question of how do I make it easy for somebody else is where a lot of the work that I do when I'm starting to build out a component like really comes into play. So some of the early stuff that I do early, like very early in the process when I'm like, okay, I'm breaking down a page. And as you said, like we are very much trained as engineers to look for the reusable stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so very early on, we're already looking at design and we're like, look, this thing is reused, so I can make this into a reusable component.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine in like small cases, right? But occasionally, like you don't realize that you're about to make a reusable component that's handling, 3 to 5 plus states. And that starts to get really unwieldy, and no one's going to use that in
Mm.
the end because they're going to have to supply so many props to it. It becomes actually not easy to use. So one of the things I do at the beginning stage is I actually write down the API for the component. And this is
Hmm.
ensuring, like from the outside, when you start using the component, that you're actually thinking about the end user, which is you as an engineer and your fellow engineers. And some of the points of it are like, how much insight do I want to give them to how this component works internally? Maybe I want them to know, maybe I don't, and that's a big
Mm-hmm.
consideration. How easy do I want the API to be? How many props? Can I limit the number of props so that they're not frustrated with this? Can I make these really clear? That's some of the like really early stuff.
And making a configuration object like prop, a prop that is just a configuration, is just more props. Like you're not
Yeah.
you're not lying to anybody. That does not solve the problem.
No,
You
it
can have one
doesn't.
prop that's an object of configuration. That's just a bunch of props.
Right. No, I've started to like do this thing at work where I was like, if I see prop types dot object somewhere, I'm going to ask you to flatten it out, and we're going to see how many props this actually adds. Because you
Hmm.
can't, like, that's an anti pattern to me. Like, you can't do that. It
Hmm.
really is just like you're just lengthening out this prop list. Um, and I think people just think, oh, but this is how React is supposed to be. we are supposed to get reusable components out of it. It's meant to accept props. Like, why would we, you know, need to think about these things? And my response is like, well, your whole app is essentially like one component that you're feeding in all the props you could ever want. Do you just want to
Mm.
create one component that could be your entire application? That's the reason why we break it out. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I've got a blog post about that where you could build your entire app as a single component, but there are good reasons to break it up. And you know what? Code duplication is not a bad thing
no,
by itself.
it's not.
It's totally acceptable, and sometimes it makes things simpler.
It does. Sometimes it's fine to duplicate a component, add a change to it, and rename it, this thing with whatever. I do that a lot. So, we have event listings on our site right now. Sometimes the event is going to be waitlisted, and so, it changes it how it looks a little bit. I'd rather just create a waitlisted event component and pull up the logic to decide if it's waitlisted or not somewhere else. I don't want to keep it encapsulated in the event component. Like, that's not its job.
Mm. Yeah, so that's an interesting point to bring up. So, there seem to be two schools of thought around this idea, where you have some people who say, let's break out these components, break them down into their smallest pieces.
Hmm.
Like any component that's longer than 3 or 4 lines is probably like an anti-pattern or something. And then you have other people on the other side of the spectrum who just make these giant render methods of like all of this JSX in there, and it's managing a bunch of state and has several concerns all lumped into one big component. Where do you see yourself based on your experience? What has worked the best for you, and can you elaborate a little bit on how that's worked for you?
I think for me, mostly it's been separation of concerns. So I don't lean so much on the size of the component. What I'm more concerned about is what does this component need to know? What do other components need to know about this one? Um, does my whole application is going to be affected by something that's done in this component? So
Hmm.
thinking about those sorts of rules and then starting to break it down. And obviously, I think one of the big early mistakes that I made was putting a lot of business logic in my components. And so I'm just a proponent of the more you lift that up and out, your components become way cleaner.
Hmm.
So that's a big deal for me. But I don't lean, I would guess, heavily on the like if it's everything should be a certain size. And I
Hmm.
definitely do not go towards the rat nest, like everything in there components. I tend to be like a hybrid approach as much as possible.
Yeah, yeah. So it's not like a quantitative figure that you can put a ESLint rule on this and say if this then it's bad. But you may make it more intentional, I guess.
Yeah. It's similar to how I feel about dry and
Hmm.
reuse. I mean, I think that dry is when you go hard at that rule, you probably end up making poor choices. And also, when you leave
Yeah.
it out completely, you probably end up making poor choices. It's really about over time getting experiences with the trade offs of what's going to happen if you duplicate something or not. Like, yes, it's annoying if I need to change the events component and the waitlisted events component, that they both need that change now. But it's two changes. It's not 20. In that case, you might want to start thinking of an extra layer of abstraction on top that's going to prevent that.
Hmm. But it all comes down to being intentional
Yeah.
about the design of your components. Yeah, that's very good. So when we're being intentional about design, we have to know what our intent is, and that I think is that something that just comes from experience, or is there, and therefore you just have to use it for 5 years before you gain that intuition, or are there things that people can do? You mentioned documenting the component first,
Yep.
which I think is a great practice. Are there other things that people can do to kind of accelerate or increase the impact of the time and experience that they have so that they can avoid some of these pitfalls and be more intentional about building their components and abstractions?
are a few things I've done to really ramp up more quickly on this. Um, One is becoming like having a method for breaking down components, which includes now I remove a lot of the content in the components so I can see them without the content because the content can be really distracting sometimes when you're
Hmm.
trying to figure out separation of concerns for things. The other thing I
And by
do,
content, you mean like the JSX that you're rendering? Is that what you mean?
like if I'm looking at like a list of events, I'll actually like remove the text from inside of each event so
Mm,
that I can sort of see a little bit more about like, well, okay, taking all the content out, taking all the text out, what is this component actually concerned about and what does it actually need to do? And that really
got it. Okay.
narrows it down when I'm building out the component API. That's helped tremendously, like getting better at this. And the other thing I do is I read a lot of code from open source libraries. So that's how I usually start to work with new patterns. Like the render props pattern, I actually learned from Downshift, like reading through Downshift. Um,
Cool.
so I do a lot of looking at, we pull in a lot of third party React libraries, date pickers and selects and tooltips and things. And it's really beneficial to find, two or three of them and look through their source code and figure out what they did differently from each other and figure out the trade-offs of those things, the pros and the cons. And that really helps you see like why you would want to maybe introduce a pattern into your own code base or why you might want to stay away from it in certain cases, those types of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like looking at other people's code, especially if what you're trying to do is build an abstraction that works, looking at other abstractions that have been proven to work and see how they went about doing that and the patterns that they implemented and how those patterns were implemented. That makes a lot of sense. I myself have learned just a huge amount from open source libraries and also contributing to open source libraries
Hmm.
because then you get these pros reviewing your pull requests and things and they can give you some feedback there, so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. And also thinking about how you would improve it. Um,
Mm.
a lot of this was kicked off by me using third party libraries and being like, this is not feeling good. Why doesn't this
Hmm.
feel good? How could I make this feel good? So,
Yeah, I remember early on in my JavaScript programming days, I had a friend, Merrick Christensen, who told me, "Hey, if you want to get better at JavaScript, take underscore," which was like this was before Lodash was much of a thing. He said, "Take underscore and re-implement all the methods. So you just read the documentation and write those methods, and you'll learn a lot." I never did it, but it sounded like a good idea.
oh, I definitely remember looking at some of the source code for like jQuery and having it just blow my mind. Um, like, wow. And now I do actually the same thing with the React source code. I love going into the React source code and finding out, what is so different about building out the framework than it is like using it. So it's, tremendously interesting.
Hmm. Absolutely. And um, I think at some point you have to have that revelation that the dependencies that you're using are written in the same language that you're using those dependencies with, right?
Yeah.
So like it's all JavaScript. Maybe for Reactor they're using Flow, and so you've got type definitions in there too. But it's pretty much like very familiar, even if you're not used to Flow. And so taking a little bit of time to dive in a little and understand. Well, maybe not understand right away, but
Definitely not.
like,
Absolutely no understanding right away.
yeah.
Yeah.
But like stepping through with a debugger or something so you can follow the code path, that's like huge amount of benefit there.
Yeah, it really is. And you know what? I think it's fun. That's how I enjoy spending my evening is by the glow of my computer, like debugging through React source code. It's fun.
Yeah, yeah. And if you need something warm on your legs on your laptop, you just spin up some crazy process some video, and now you're like snuggling with your laptop. It's great.
Oh, I never feel like my laptop is not a million degrees. So,
Yeah. Thank you, Tim Cook, for these beautiful machines.
so great.
Um, yeah. So um, as far as React component architecture is concerned, how do you like? What are some of the things that you found to be so? We've talked about like reusable components and maybe not always reuse things, but when we're talking about like large scale React applications, what are some things that you've found to be successful when architecting a full application?
So, do you mean like in terms
Just
of,
like you can talk about maybe file structure or like component structure. Where do you store your state, and how do you keep things in sync and that kind of thing?
I mean, I'm dealing with all of these questions right now at work. So, moving into this role of being a front end architect and not just a I don't want to say just actually, and not a senior, front end engineer contributing to one part of the code base. Now I oversee the code base.
Hmm.
I have been, you know, sort of falling in love with this while also realizing that I'm untangling like a rat's nest of things. Like I'm coming into a startup where the code base was built by, third party people first. Then they've hired a team, um, but no one on that team is as senior as I am overall, and also especially in React. Um,
Hmm.
so a lot of things have been implemented, um, and what I've been trying to do is actually come up with sort of a set of rules by which I'll make decisions architecture wise, not just to do
Hmm.
with components, but things like, one of my rules is that a engineer early in their career should be able to come into our code base and get up to speed quickly. And that
Hmm.
is an overall rule that really just has to do with consistency in your code base. Because if they can't grep around in the code base, if they can't find that every example of what they might want to do is consistent, it makes it so much harder for them moving forward. So I want
Hmm.
to put in place these rules about we consistently use this state management library. Like truthfully, right now we have Redux, and then we're using RSAAs and thunks and rematch. Someone put in place, all these different things. So if I have
Hmm.
a person come in now, they're finding multiple ways of doing things. So consistency. I really want to be able to look around at how components are built and see that they're being built along sort of the same guidelines. So I'm starting to hand down some rules and guidelines to my engineers about keeping business logic out of things. Where do we actually do the management of deciding what gets passed down to components business logic wise and what changes? Um,
Hmm.
so those types of things so that someone can come in and have a good sense of like how we build things. That
So
answers the
does
question.
yeah. Do these rules take the form of like some guidelines and principles in some sort of document, or do you have a strict set of ESLint plugins that you use, or how do you kind of guide the engineering so that they follow these rules properly?
I'm starting to put in place some more ESLint rules. We haven't had a lot of them to date. So we definitely have just like visual inconsistencies in our code, stylistic inconsistencies. So putting
Hmm.
those in place. The rest of it, though, is sort of where I'm able to do this because we're not a large team, but I can, I offer to pair with people. They're welcome to come pair with me at any time. I review a lot of code reviews that I'm not even on, or I step in with those things. And then I hold a monthly front end guild meeting where we talk about some of these issues together, about how to build things. I pass on a lot of resources. I ask them to go to conferences, workshops, got them an egghead course, um,
Hmm.
trying to cram knowledge into my team. So, yeah,
Uh-huh. You just like flood them with resources
yes.
and yeah.
Because in some ways, like I say, they're rules and really they're guidelines. I'm only going to put my foot down every once in a while if I don't give them as much as I want consistency. If I also don't give my team freedom to play around with stuff, they're not going to understand why I've asked them to do it a certain way. There is
Mm.
benefit in letting people see that something doesn't work and then revise it later. And I
Hmm.
personally do not see revision or refactoring as a failure. I think a lot of people do, but I don't.
I love that. Can you dig into that a little bit more, Jen? Like, why is revision and refactoring not a failure? I've had many times in my career where I've let's try this abstraction, and it just is a terrible experience for everyone, and it takes me a week to backtrack off of that. So why do you see that as not a failure?
I think it's part of the natural course of our jobs. And if you're not doing it, what value are you getting? I mean, you need to make the mistakes to learn something, and sometimes it's not even that what you wrote was a mistake. It was right maybe for the time, but things change. And so you
Hmm.
actually like need to go to revisions and refactorings. One, if you're doing this from someone else's code that they wrote, um, come to it with the best of intentions. Remember that they wrote it under circumstances that you weren't there for. Um, so I think a lot of people, they come in, they see some code, it's not great according to them, and
Mm-hmm.
they're like, "Oh, I have to refactor this. This is bad code." And like,
Hmm.
you don't know what that code was written under unless you're literally the one that wrote it, and then you get to say whatever you want about your old code. Like,
Yeah.
I curse myself a lot. Um, but this is the natural form of things. If you build code under tight deadlines and you're new to a framework, you're not going to be putting out your A plus right away things. Your first draft
Mm-hmm.
is never the end draft. You're always revising as you go along, and you're learning things from those revisions. Um, so I very much I really want people to see refactoring as a just a natural progression of our jobs and not a failure at all.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. That it makes me feel better. So yeah, really good. So Jen, as we're reaching toward the end of our time here, is there anything else about React component architecture or application architecture that you'd like to specifically call out and chat about before we wrap up?
I think mostly what we've talked about, try writing down the component architecture before you start. Like, try from the outside to see what your component's going to look like before you actually start to implement it. It's really going to help you lean into that declarative nature that is React too. It
Hmm.
really helps with that. And then remember that you're probably going to write this thing and it may not work, and it might work, and then a couple months later you come back to it and you hate yourself for it. It's all fine. It's totally fine. I if I go back and look at the components I first wrote 5 years ago, I will be horrified and I will just stay in my
Hmm.
house forever and never leave. Uh, except that I have a healthy mindset that I was learning. I was new. So
Yeah, exactly. That's wonderful. So there you have it, everybody. The call to action or your homework for this episode is for the next component that you write, document that component first. And this isn't just for reusable components, right, Jen? Like
yeah.
this is something that's useful, even if it's this little widget over here that's only going to be used on this page, or if you think it's going to be a reusable component, definitely document it first. That I like that idea a lot.
Cool.
So, Jen, what's the best people for, or what's the best way for people to reach you online?
Definitely Twitter. My handle is girl code, girl spelled with a U. I'm pretty active on there, so you can tweet me.
Excellent. And if you're ever in New York City, you've got a meetup that people can go to, right?
Yes, so I'm also a co-organizer for the Use React NYC meetup. We just got started earlier this year. We just had our fourth meetup, and we're continuing them monthly. Might take a break around the holidays. But if you happen to be in New York, please look us up. We love new faces in our community.
Mm-hmm. I spoke 2 months ago, a month ago, some pretty recently, and it was a wonderful experience. So yeah, strong recommend there. Great. Well, Jen, thank you so much for giving us some of your time this afternoon or evening or morning, whenever people end up listening to this. Really appreciate your time. And I hope that everybody enjoyed hearing you as much as I enjoyed chatting with you. So thank you. And yeah, we'll see you all later. Bye, friends.
Bye, friends.